Hello and welcome to the daily newspaper analysis. Today we shall be discussing the newspaper of the 26th of January 2018. But before that, I would like to wish all of you a very happy Republic Day. So on that note, let's begin. The first article is, should euthanasia be allowed? Now, this is a very important article, not only from social issue perspective, but also it is of much relevance as a debate in the ethics paper. So you can find a question in either of these contexts. Now, coming to the context of this article itself, the context is that an elderly Mumbai couple, Mr. and Mrs. Levarts, have demanded for active euthanasia. They had been continuously writing to several chief ministers, and now they have written to the president himself requesting him to allow the couple to adopt for euthanasia. So that is the entire context. Now, before we delve into the points that have been analyzed, some background is vital. Now, you need to understand that there is something of a difference between active and passive euthanasia. Now, first and foremost, coming to passive euthanasia is a form of euthanasia where death is induced passively. For example, a person is terminally ill and he is on a ventilator support or some particular medicinal support. In such a scenario, this support system is what is removed, and this will induce natural death to the person. So this is passive euthanasia. Now, active euthanasia is a form of euthanasia in which death is induced directly. For example, a lethal drug is given to a person or some other form is adopted to directly induce death in the person. So this is what is active euthanasia. Now, you need to know that passive euthanasia is something that is allowed in India. This was a judgment given in the 2011 Aruna Shanubag case, and passive euthanasia is not allowed in every situation, but rather it has to be strictly monitored by the direct monitoring by the High Court itself, and also by a team of doctors who need to approve passive euthanasia. So in rarest of the rare cases, under strict vigilance, passive euthanasia is legal in India. But active euthanasia is something that is totally illegal, and it is active euthanasia which has been demanded in this case. So that is one analysis. Another thing is some background related to the 2011 Aruna Shanubag case. Now, you need to know something about Aruna Shanubag, who was a nurse in the Mumbai King Edward Memorial Hospital. She was raped in the year 1973 by a ward boy in this hospital, and since then she was in a permanently vegetative state. And so this case came to prominence in the year 2011 when it was demanded that passive euthanasia be allowed from Aruna Shanubag. However, the Supreme Court did allow this passive euthanasia. The Supreme Court ruled that in rarest of the rare cases where there was no scope of recovery, in such cases passive euthanasia should be allowed. But despite this ruling by the Supreme Court itself, the euthanasia was not done, and she died a natural death of cardiac arrest in the year 2015. So that is what is relevant here. Now, coming to another aspect which is important in the background is with regards to suicides in India. Now, you need to know that previously under section 309 of the IPC, suicide was a criminal offense in the country. If a person who has attempted suicide is saved and he does not die, in such a scenario, the person was liable to a criminal punishment of 1 year or a fine, or both a punishment as well as a fine. Now, recently this has been decriminalized with the implementation of the Mental Health Care Act of 2017. It is after this act that the section 309 has been decriminalized, and it has been said that a person who has attempted suicide is to be considered as a person suffering from a mental illness and who is under stress, and in such a scenario therapy is to be given to that person. So as of now, this is a decriminalized offense. So that is what is important. Though in this article this is mentioned as a criminal offense under section 309, but that is an incorrect information. It is at present decriminalized. Now, coming to the points that have been given in this editorial, first and foremost is that yes, euthanasia should be allowed. Now, how is it justified? First and foremost, the author talks about Article 21. This is the article which gives every citizen of India the right to life. Now, here the author argues that if there is a right to life, then that means that I am the owner of my own life. And if I am the owner of my own life, then in such a scenario, I should have the right to take away my life myself, and no state should patriarchally tell me that whether or not I should be living or I should not be living. So that is one analysis. Another thing is with regards to decriminalization of suicide itself. Now, the recent decriminalization of suicide under in the aftermath of the Mental Health Care Act itself says that suicide should not be seen as a crime. So taking one's own life is not a crime, rather it is a personal decision of a person, and in this regard also euthanasia should be allowed. So that is one analysis. Another thing is that the couple who in this case who have been demanding for active euthanasia have raised a point that they do not wish to be a burden on the society. Now, this question is something that is important because elderly are often requiring greater support by the society. They require healthcare, specific healthcare needs. A lot of investment is done by the government for their welfare. So in such a scenario, a question can be raised that what is the purpose of all this welfare of the elderly when ultimately they are supposed to die? So in that regard, this one analysis has been drawn that they are largely a burden on the society. Another issue is with regards to the wastage of financial resources. This is not only with regards to the financial resources of the state, which the state is investing in the welfare of the elderly, but also with regards to personal financial resources. For example, a couple does not wish to spend so much on the health of each other, or for that matter, family does not wish to spend on the health expenses of the elderly. So in such a scenario, it is a burden on the personal expenses of a family is what has been argued here. Now, another aspect that has been analyzed is with regards to the cultural backwardness in the society. Now, this is something that is important. You need to understand that traditionally in India, the culture is such that suffering, old age, a disability, all of these things are considered something as a part of destiny. And in this regard, they are not seen objectively and is seen rather as a part of one's karma. So in such a scenario, with such kind of a mindset, it is happening that euthanasia is not being allowed in this country. So they are saying that it is a matter of cultural backwardness. And now this should be removed and seen in a newer light of objectivity, where these problems should be seen as genuine problems of the people who are facing these pains. It should not be seen as their mere destiny with which they are supposed to live with. Rather, a choice should be given to these people. So that is one analysis. Another aspect is with regards to a legal compulsion. Now, a question has been raised that why should a person live only because it is a legal compulsion to live and he has no personal will to live? That has been analyzed. Another thing which is important is with regards to the living wills. This is something that is a question that is being raised, which is under the observation of the Supreme Court also. Now, living wills is a concept that is prevalent in some countries. For example, it is allowed in countries like Canada. Now, this by living will, it means that people have a power, who are sane, can decide for the future that if they fall into a vegetative state, then what do they wish should happen with them? So in such a scenario, they can previously only decide that if ever they get a disability or they become vegetatively crippled or anything like that, they become very old. In such a scenario, whether or not they wish to live or not. So this is something that they can decide. So this is one question, that should living wills be made acceptable in India also. So that is one important debate that is going on. Another aspect which has been analyzed is with regards to the practice of euthanasia, which is allowed in several other countries. For example, countries like Luxembourg, Netherlands and Belgium, all of these countries, even Switzerland in some cases, allows euthanasia. So an advocacy is being made that when other countries are allowing, India should also allow. Now, having discussed this yes part, focus more should be on the no part. Even in your answers, you will see that how the no part is more weighing than the yes part, than the case against euthanasia is more weighted ethically as compared to the yes argument of euthanasia. So that is one analysis that is in general, and your answer should have that weightage. Now, first and foremost, the argument is that of a global scenario. Now, here the author has argued that even if countries like Luxembourg, Netherlands, Belgium, Switzerland, they are allowing euthanasia, but in these countries also it is not an open practice, and even it is being allowed in some of the rarest of the rare cases. And so the global sentiment, the ethical consideration globally is that euthanasia is something that is not acceptable and it should not be permissible. So that is one argument that has been given. Another aspect is with regards to the chances of misuse. Now, euthanasia simply to make it permissible by law is easy, but it will have several ground problems. For example, it could result in a misuse for demand of property and money from the elderly. It could result it could result in animosities in the family. It could result in penalizing the elderly, and also the issue is that it could result in depression. Because if a person is already sick, in such a scenario the person is not in the most healthy mental condition. Obviously the person is going through a mental trauma because of his sickness. So even if the person is very much able to decide for himself, the decision is not going to be a justified one, because his mental scenario is one of depression. So that is one analysis. So there is a huge scope for its misuse, and this will lead to a lot of litigation in this matter. It could increase the burden of the judiciary. So those are some ground aspects which need to be analyzed in this regard. Another aspect is with regards to active euthanasia as being completely unacceptable. Here the author makes a case that if a person is mentally alert, and if along with being mentally alert, the person is of a reasonably health, then in such a scenario allowing for euthanasia is something that is akin to suicide, and it should not be allowed in any healthy society. So that is one argument. Another thing with regards to the no argument is an analysis of passive euthanasia issues itself. For example, the justification for passive euthanasia has been the cost that the government is bearing on keeping these patients alive. But you have to see that isn't it a moral and ethical responsibility of the state to provide for this population who has been fallen victim to or has fallen prey to such adverse situations? It should be a moral responsibility of the state and the society to cooperate with such people rather than brutally choose to killing them. So this is one argument which has been made even against passive euthanasia. For example, as I mentioned before also, that in the Aruna Shanuba case also, despite the fact that the Supreme Court allowed for passive euthanasia, the other co-nurses in the hospital did not allow passive euthanasia on her, and they volunteered to provide care and service to Aruna Shanuba until and unless she suffered a natural death. So this is one scenario, that this entire spirit of service is something that should take precedence over practicalities like costs and such kind of issues. So that is one important analysis here. Another thing is with regards to elderly as a source. Now India's population is largely young at present, and with improving health facilities, the number of elderly are bound to rise in the country. So this judgment of allowing active euthanasia for the elderly is something that can be akin to abdication of its responsibility by the society and the state. The elderly rather needs to be seen as a resource, a vital resource for the country, and they need to be used. This argument has even been reiterated by the Prime Minister himself, that they have knowledge, they have skills, they have capacities, and these capacities need to be utilized in the country. So that is one analysis which has been given here. Another thing is with the issue of value of life. Now this is important analysis from the ethics paper. What is the cost of life? Can life be given a particular figure in terms of cost? For example, the cost of sustaining a person is 10 lakh rupees. So it can be decided that because of this high cost, the person should be killed by passive euthanasia. But is the cost of a human life 10 lakh rupees? So these are moral and ethical questions that a figure cannot be put on the life of a human being. And as a result of that, euthanasia is something that cannot be allowed for humans, and active euthanasia specifically should not be allowed for humans. That is what has been argued here. So these are the yes and the no arguments. Coming to the third set of arguments, which is about it's complicated. Now this analyzes first and foremost the Article 21 of the Constitution. As I mentioned, the Article 21 is about the right to life and liberty. Now here it has been analyzed that the Article 21 is omnipresent. The courts have several times reiterated that even during emergency, the Article 21 cannot be taken away from the citizens, which means that the right to life is something that can never, under no circumstances, can this right be taken away from the citizens unless it is as per a rule or procedure established by law. So only in that scenario this can be allowed. For example, when death penalty is given, so in that scenario it is a procedure established by law. So in that scenario only this right can be taken. Now the omnipresence of this article itself is a deterrence to allowing euthanasia, because right to life is sacrosanct. That is what has been analyzed here. And if ever euthanasia is to be allowed, definitely a law is what is required in this regard. So it should not be a case-to-case basis, but rather a law is required. So this brings us to our second point, which is that there is an absence of law in the country on this issue of euthanasia. So often this question is time and again comes before the courts, for example, even of mercy deaths, euthanasia, often in case of abortion rights of women, the rights of the unborn child. In all these cases, this question is time and again being coming to the courts, and the courts are, in the absence of a law, are largely deciding on a case-to-case basis, which is resulting in an ad hoc judgments. And this has created a lot of arbitrariness on this issue. So definitely a law in this regard is something that is what is needed in the present time. This is what has been analyzed. Another aspect which is important in this regard is the issue of dignity. Now, definitely the right to life is sacrosanct, but shouldn't life be something viewed along with dignity? If there is no dignity, then what is the relevance of this right to life? For example, a case has been given of the suicide of the farmers in Vidarbha. It has been noted that these farmers committed suicide primarily because they had a life, but their life was not one of dignity. So in this backdrop, they chose to commit suicide. So can this step by these farmers totally be considered wrong? So definitely, if the government is advocating, if the civil society is advocating that right to life is sacrosanct, then in that scenario, right to dignity is also sacrosanct, and this should be ensured. For example, if the elderly are in a state where they are vegetative or they are crippled, in such a scenario, what is the dignity of these patients? Is the healthcare system of the country providing them the adequate dignity with which they deserve? So until and unless this dignity is provided, how can one argue that right to life is sacrosanct? So that is an important analysis here. Another thing is with regards to the right to choice. The right to life in itself should also have a right to choice, is what has been argued here. So definitely this is debatable, that right to life and right to choice, whether they are complementary or they are not. So that is the analysis which has been brought about in the arguments of it's complicated. Definitely, as I mentioned, the article is of utmost importance from several aspects. So that is why we've discussed it elaborately also. Now coming to the next article. The grounding of Air India. The opinion is that when the public sector does not serve the public interest, it becomes a millstone around our necks. Now, the context is of the new foreign direct investment policy of the government, where foreign airlines can now invest up to 49% in Air India. So that is the entire context, but the article is not specifically focused on Air India and has a general analysis of the entire public sector in the country. So that is the importance of this article. Now, before that, some background of Air India. Now, Air India was formed in the year 1932. At that point of time, it was formed by as a private enterprise under J.R.D. Tata, and it was called as Tata Air Services. Later, it was called as Tata Airlines. And it was only in the year 1946, in the aftermath of the Second World War, that large stakes of Air India, of Tata Airlines, were taken by the government, and it became Air India. Later, in the year 1953, it was completely taken over by the government of India. So that is some background and history of the Air India. At present, the Air India has a debt of approximately $8 billion. So that is a huge debt which this public sector enterprise has on itself. Another aspect is that this has continuously been making losses, and it has a very small market share, which is approximately less than 15% of the market share is what is there of Air India. So these are the background related to this change in policy, change in government stance on Air India. Now some issues is what has been analyzed here. First is that of an analysis of the mixed economy model adopted by India. Now this failure of the public sector enterprise calls for a review of this mixed economy model which India adopted in the aftermath of its independence. Here, contrary to several articles, this editorial has brought about an appreciation of this mixed economy model. It says that contrary to the two other models prevalent at that time, which was the socialist model by Russia, this model itself failed with the disintegration of Russia. The other model was the capitalist model, which was followed by US. And this model too faced severe challenges during the 2008 financial crisis. So in this background, it was the mixed economic model of India which has sustained and which has itself proven to be one of the most successful models. So that is one aspect. Another aspect which has been said in the favor of the public sector model in India is that during the time when the public sector model was was specifically mooted in the aftermath of independence and under Nehru till 1960s, largely the public sector model has been a profiteering model. It has steered the economy out of its conundrums and out of its darkness. That is one analysis. Also, during this time from 1950s to 1960s, India's growth rates was even higher than China. So this is again a proof that this model was a successful one. Also, a case has been given of the HMT, which is the Hindustan Machine Tools. In the year 1962, the HMT started a second plant which was entirely funded by itself. So not only was this model self-sustaining, it was even profiteering to set up newer functioning groups. So that was one analysis here. Also, the author said that during this time, despite the fact that there was a license permit Raj, but the private sector also expanded. So, in a nutshell, he has largely brought about the positives of the mixed economy model. So that is one analysis of this editorial. Another aspect is with regards to the problems with public sector. Now, if the mixed economy model and the public sector led growth model was so successful, then what was the problem with it? Now, the problem, the author says, came from the year 1965 onwards, and this was largely because of a political change rather than any problem in specific to the public sector. Now, with this political change and Mrs. Indira Gandhi taking over the reins of the Congress party and the leadership of the country, in such a scenario, what happened is that there was a shift in the focus of viewing the public sector as a fulcrum of the economy, and it became a populist measure. It became a political instrument. So it was viewed as a source to employ more and more people. So such kind of populist measures with regards to the public sector is something that has hampered its growth. So this is the problem with public sector, is what has been analyzed. Another issue is with regards to the relevance of public sector. Now here the author brings about a very good analysis. He says that the Air India has a share of less than 15%, and so it can easily be replaced by the private sector. But the relevance of public sector is something that is important in several other scenarios. For example, in the railways. Railways is exclusively a public sector, and there is no private sector in railways. So if the nemesis of public sector continue to prevail in these areas also, where there is no competition, so it will definitely have very much adversarial impacts on the economy and on the welfare of the people. For example, in the case of the railways, it is said that the recent derailments in railways have largely happened due to inadequate signaling equipment and damaged tracks. So all of this is a reflection that how public sector indeed needs to be revamped. So that is one case here. Also, the case of populism, which I had mentioned, a very important example has been given, that in the year 2012, you should know, the railway minister was suspended for raising the prices of railways, for raising the fares in railways. At that time, it was a coalition government of the UPA, and Mrs. Mamta Banerjee's party, the Trinamool Congress, was holding the railways department, and Mrs. Mamta Banerjee had suspended the railway minister for raising fares. So if such kind of populism is something that is going to be prevalent, then definitely public sector cannot expand and cannot be a successful endeavor. That is what has been analyzed here. Another thing is with regards to public sector as vis-a-vis inflation in the country. Now, public sector can never be immune from inflation. This is a common economic understanding. So it will be naive to ensure that public sector remains unaffected by inflation. If there is inflation, then definitely fares of railway should increase, bus fares should increase, but due to populist measures, this insulation that the public sector is provided with is something that is a nemesis for the public sector. This is what has been analyzed. Another aspect that is important here is the case of Kerala. Now here the editorial brings about an analysis that Kerala is ruled by a communist party, and despite this ideology of the Communist Party, the government in Kerala has gone in for reforms of public sector and has tried to make it less populist and more practical, and this is a successful model in Kerala, and the author is advocating that this model should be adopted by the entire country. So that is one analysis. The final opinion is that public sector will be a jewel when worn in public interest, but when not worn in public interest, it will become a millstone. So that is the opinion here. The article is of relevance not only from Air India perspective, but as I mentioned before, in general from public sector analysis, and also from analyzing the economy, the mixed economic model of the country. So that is the relevance here. Coming to the next article, held by the mob. Now, the context here is that of the recent attacks on a bus carrying school children in Gurugram. This has happened in the backdrop of the protests against the release of the movie Padmavat. Now, we have been analyzing this issue continuously, and several editorials have come in the past, but this editorial has some newer issues, so only those issues is what I have focused on. First is with regards to the image of India. Definitely the image of India in this regard is at stake, especially in the backdrop of the Republic Day celebration, and 10 leaders of the ASEAN countries are in India. So in this backdrop, if such kind of cases are coming where a bus carrying school children was attacked, it is something which has brought immense bad image to the country. So this is of course a cause of concern. Another thing is with regards to state abdication of responsibility. Now, despite the Supreme Court's ban on the activities, on the protests which have been objecting to the release of the movie, despite that, if such kind of incidences are happening in the states, then it is akin to the abdication of responsibility of the states, as the states have clearly failed to maintain law and order. So this is definitely a cause of concern. Another aspect which is very, very important here is the role of the chief ministers in this case. For example, chief ministers of the states of Rajasthan, MP, Uttar Pradesh, Gujarat have all been issuing orders about the need for the film to have heeded the lines of history. Now, this is an irresponsible role that the chief ministers have played, because the chief ministers are not empowered to decide as to what kind of movie should be made and to decide on deliberate upon the freedom of expression. So this is definitely a shift in the precedence, and this is a cause of concern. Another issue is with regards to the CBFC certification. I had mentioned before also that if challenges are being raised to the movie despite the fact that it has been certified by the CBFC, then it is an attack on the sovereignty of this institution itself. This body, the CBFC, is a statutory body, and it is going to lose its integrity and its relevance. So that is one issue here. Another thing is with regards to mob violence. This can be asked as a question that how should mob violence be maintained, or how should it be countered? So definitely an analysis is important, that when mob violence happens, what is the role of the administration in dealing with mob violence? So this is a stark case and an important example in that regard. Another case is with regards to some past cases. For example, this Karni Sena, which is involved in the protests, had raised similar protests in the year 2008 in the backdrop of the release of the movie Jodha Akbar. Now, if this scenario is being repeated, then it is something of a cause for churning by the government itself, that no reforms have been taken by the government to counter such situation, because this is a repetition that is happening. So this is the entire analysis of this editorial. The previous editorials in this regard are comparatively more analytical and more important, but definitely these points are also of importance here. Now, coming to the next article, Delhi Declarations calls for joint fight against terror. Now, though this is not a very analytical one, but some important points were there in this article, so I'm discussing it, though this is not an article on the editorial page. So coming to the context is, as always, is the India-ASEAN Summit, which is taking place in the behest of the Republic Day celebration, where all the 10 ASEAN leaders have been invited as chief guests. Now, the issues important to this Delhi Declaration is why I have kept this article for discussion. First is with regards to counter-terrorism. Now, it is the first time in the history of India-ASEAN relations that so explicitly counter-terrorism has been discussed, and it has been openly declared as an initiative which will be taken by India along with ASEAN. Now, in this regard, you need to understand that what is the relevance of counter-terrorism operations with ASEAN for India, because the terrorism in India is largely emanating from India's western border, which is Pakistan, and India does not have an issue of terrorism with its eastern border, but this agreement nevertheless has several ramifications for India. First and foremost, it is with regards to the ISIS. Now, ISIS has been posing severe threats, especially in countries like Philippines. So that is one important aspect here, that India can see cooperation here. Another aspect where this is important is in curbing radicalism. Now, if India is fighting against radicalism, then support from any country in this regard is something that India will welcome. Also, it will support India's cause for listing terrorists in Pakistan. For example, the Jaish-e-Mohammed chief Masood Azhar, he was not given his declaration as an international terrorist was something that was blocked by China in the UN. So if India is going to have such kind of agreements with the Asian countries, then India's cause will find crescendo on international platforms like the UN. So that is the importance of this agreement for India. Now, coming to the second issue which has been analyzed, it is with regards to defense and maritime cooperation. Definitely, this is of utmost importance to India, not only for its security purposes, but also in the backdrop of rising China in India's in the Indian Ocean, the string of pearls policy of China and the border and road initiative of China. In that backdrop, definitely this agreement is of much relevance. Another aspect that has been discussed is with regards to border management. This is especially with Myanmar, because Myanmar shares a large border with the northeast, and this can be critical for India to curb insurgency, Maoism, and these kind of issues and internal security threats to the northeastern India. So definitely this agreement here is of relevance. Another aspect which has been analyzed is that of the rules-based global architecture. This is of utmost importance in the backdrop of the United Nations Convention on Laws of the Seas, not only because this is relevant for the South China Sea, but because China is showing extreme presence in the Indian Ocean also. And recently China had denied a permanent arbitration council's decision with regards to South China Sea. So in such a scenario, if all these countries are reiterating their commitment to our rules-based global architecture, then definitely this is indeed a welcome precedence for both India as well as Asia. So that is one analysis. Another thing is the importance of the 3 Cs, that is of culture, commerce and connectivity. This I discussed yesterday also. So again, this has been reiterated in the Delhi Declaration. Another issue is with regards to drug trafficking. Now, India is facing a huge problem of drug trafficking, and the ASEAN, 3 countries of the ASEAN, that is Myanmar, Thailand and Laos, they form the Golden Triangle, which is the hotspot of drug trafficking in the entire world. So definitely, if an agreement is made in this regard, it is a welcome precedent, and it will have impacts on tackling internal security and organized crime. So this is important from the internal security point of view, because drug trafficking is part of the organized crime. So that is the relevance here. Another aspect is with regards to regional power balance to counter China. Now here, what is important is that despite the fact that some countries in the ASEAN themselves are close to China, for example, Cambodia has a warm relationship with China, but both ASEAN and India have a common interest where they want to counter a rising China. So in such a scenario, if both these zones partner with each other, then they can provide an adequate balancing power to a rising China, and this is in the interest of both the ASEAN as well as India. So these are the analyses which have been drawn in this regard. Yesterday we had discussed all about the irritants between India and ASEAN. So these are the synergistic parts of the India-ASEAN partnership. So that is what is the relevance of this particular article here. Now, before we finish, some piece of information. We are starting a UPSC prelims cum mains classes from the 28th of January 2018. It shall be covering all the basics. So all interested candidates, please do get in touch with us. These are our contact details and this is our phone number. So with this, we finish today's discussion. I thank you all for watching and I hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you.